It is that double-edged sword, but how do we balance that, do you think? Hani?
Yeah, I would say that, the bad actors at play are going to leverage every bit of technology they can.
Whatever your infrastructure layer is has to be rock solid and well understood. The middle layer is data. How do you gather it? How do you secure it? How do you govern it? Really, really important layer. And when we look at most customers, that's the area where help is most needed.
People adapting to the use of technology. When you introduce technology to them, there was this kind of wall between the keyboard and the person.
My 3 favourite are my robots.
But don't make the
Highly engaged, don't need to sleep, don't need lunch breaks, and highly high performing.
But at the core, as we've all said, it's people. So understand the people, understand the problems, the environment that the business is working within, and then work with them, again, based on the risk appetite of the business and you knowing how much you can push that envelope.
I want to jump and I kind of want to talk to Chris first. Chris, I'm picking on you because you've been on one of our podcasts before and I know you've got extensive experience in the IT sector, but have you got an interesting story for us or something that you didn't expect from the IT sector when you first kind of joined?
I thought it was more about IT than about people. And my shock has been that it's about people and culture that makes it successful. And I didn't get that. I thought it was about things, how people use things, how you fit them to them. And it was a shock to see how much is people management, is people preparation, is people education, and then the cultural differences. Even in a single country, there are cultural differences that people bring to the business.
Yeah, and you have worked all over the world. So
Yeah.
What makes Australia different?
Apart from the climate, which is absolutely amazing, Australia to me is very interesting because I'm British and Canadian and I've worked in the US. And Australia seems to have components from each of those countries. I find the IT here is more professionalized than in many other countries. And I'm not quite sure why.
Yeah. And Sid, what did you not expect from the IT industry? What surprised you about the industry?
I think the biggest surprise I got from the industry was just the difference between the academics and the real world applications. Processes, again, as Chris said, people, the utilization of technology to solve sort of admin problems, day-to-day problems, all of that was a big shock. And I came from an engineering background, so I was always looking for technology to solve like ERP problems or application problems. And the use cases were just so difficult to find. People adapting to the use of technology. When you introduce technology to them, there was this kind of wall between the keyboard and the person. And it's usually, we were talking earlier, the problems are between sort of that keyboard and the person. You kind of have to almost let it be. And that was sort of 10, 11 years ago. And now I've been sort of working in the same space, but in different departments and different areas, but I'm still solving same problems.
Yeah.
So it's been sort of a big learning exercise, how to get people involved in using technology.
And actually, I see Sky kind of nodding away there. Sky, did you kind of share a similar experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can implement the best process, the best piece of technology, but unless people understand how it works and the benefit to them, adoption's pretty hard. And so the change management piece to any deployment of technology is probably the most underrated, but most critical part of any implementation. And usually, I was just joking with some team members recently where it was user error. So it is the problem between the keyboard and the seat. Was it you or was it the process? Usually the process is fine.
Yeah.
Usually the technology is fine. It's the understanding of the people and how it can add value to their lives.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you, and I think it's a really good point. We see a lot of failed projects, not with the user adoption, no change management, or not adequate. A lot of the problem we see, if you wind it back, is rooted in the project not aligning to the strategy of the business. And I think it all starts there. And if you get the strategy of your business underpinned then by the technology, it makes it easier to explain to people why we did something and why user adoption and change management is really important. But I 100% agree, that's such a difficult thing. And to your point, people are the biggest part of technology.
Yeah.
It surprises me every day.
Yeah, they're definitely at the forefront, and it's something that's been echoed throughout our previous events as well, that we can't forget the people element of it all. We've been talking about AI before we kind of jumped into this session as well, and Hani's shared some experiences and some real case studies as well. But how are you finding the evolution of AI within what you're doing?
Look, AI obviously there's a lot of hype around it, and you've got to be careful as an organisation to not jump in not fully understanding the technology. And I think each organisation has its own level of maturity, and you've got to assess where are they as an organisation and to what degree do you adopt. Now, the strategy that I'm using is to leverage the vendors who are incorporating AI in their products and using that as a soft launch, low risk way to add value and give people a taste of it while we're still maturing as an organisation.
Yeah, definitely. And there was one specific use case that you mentioned as well that I was fascinated by, but I think there's so many ways that we can implement AI within our kind of tech framework as well. But is there an area that you're particularly interested in and a particular use case that kind of you could share with us today?
Look, so for us, it's always about the strategic elements and the competitive advantage that we can add to the business. So trying to be an IT function that is forward thinking and becoming an advisory function for the business rather than just the traditional keep your lights on, it starts from that perspective. And so that means you need to understand the business. You need to engage with the operational leaders. You need to understand their day-to-day challenges and what the business is trying to achieve. You need to understand fundamentally how it makes its money, the risk profile that it's exposed to, and work with them to try and bring technology as an enabler to solve that problem. But at the core, as we've all said, it's people. So understand the people, understand the problems, the environment that the business is working within, and then work with them, again, based on the risk appetite of the business and knowing how much you can push that envelope so you can keep them engaged and supportive through the process.
Yeah. With your clients, Nick, what is their risk appetite at the moment? What are you finding?
Look, there's a lot of interest in AI and how it can be used. We're sort of very similar to what Hani's described, is where we think about it in micro-innovation, actually. So you can take small chunks of advantage of AI. It's not a silver bullet that's going to solve every problem that you've ever had. We think about a very business-led approach to it and ensuring that the business owner for the problem we're trying to solve is involved very heavily in how we solve it. Because if you get that bit right, it helps to bring the people who are affected by it on the journey, rather than, as you say, the IT department just trying to push it down. So I think I totally agree with that as well.
And I think what helps with that is that if the business leaders are engaged, it's going to be a bit of a tough journey. It's not always going to be perfect, but they're always happy to give the benefit of the doubt, happy to work with you to go overcome that next hurdle. And we both can see the end vision in mind. And I think that's really important. Again, early engagement, it's all about the people, what they're trying to achieve. And technology is really taking a back seat. It's not at the front of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We see the best people to spot the problem are the people that work in the problem every day.
Yeah.
And if they're the people that are providing the feedback, your AI that comes behind that is a lot more effective than a top-down approach.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, and look, Sid, I know you've been kind of working with a model like an ITSM model which has AI within it. Talk us through that.
So we're looking at sort of deploying something that can solve very trivial problems. Most of the time, people are trying to find resources for information. As much as it is available, people still like to be pointed to it. And then from there on, it's usually people take off on their own, they research, they solve the problem. As sort of Nick said, like usually people want to be pointed to something, and after that it's just sort of use case. So we want to kind of collect data set on what are the problems people are looking for. I'm from a retail industry, so we're looking for solving operational issues. Usually a store sort of is not able to process a sale, or it's a retail transaction that has gone haywire, or it's not appearing, or stock is not appearing. So pointing them to resources within the ERP, or pointing them to a SharePoint site or to FAQs. We're kind of wanting to integrate all of that to an experience where people are self-servicing problems rather than always wanting to lodge a ticket. So we want to kind of understand that pattern, and then before it becomes a problem, we'll basically connect the person to the resource. So rather than having 20 tickets created, we want to sort of sit an AI sort of model in front of the user, whether it's through a digital assistant or something like that, so they can interact with it. If the digital assistant cannot solve that problem, then they can log a ticket or point to a resource.
I've got two actual cases about ITSM, IT service management, where AI make that micro enhancement. So most IT people don't like to document. You know, they're techies, they want to solve the problem, but don't ask me to create a document. And so with AI, what we're finding is the opportunity when you look at the case notes, that the resolution notes at the end, instead of saying fixed, close a ticket, the AI goes through, reads all the trail and summarises what has happened. And so then the agent just has a final overview of it and go make a few adjustments if they need to and submit. And so you're getting much more richer content, much more value that can also feed in the knowledge base and continually identify problems within the network. So I think all these things are connected, whether it's an incident request, a change or a problem, and that knowledge base article is all interconnected. And I think AI has some really good opportunities to improve our governance, improve our practices with very little effort. And I think these things are easily achievable because they're internal to the function.
Yes.
You're not relying on the business to be involved, but something we can take carriage of and we will reap the benefit. But the business will also reap the benefit because you'll get a better service outcome.
Certainly.
Because you're playing to the people, in essence.
Absolutely.
I mean, sometimes I don't think I need artificial intelligence. I need artificial sensitivity and awareness, because I'll try to introduce something and afterwards I'm going, why did I do that? It's because I thought it was a good idea. But that idea about summarizing it and sending it, I think is brilliant.
Yeah. And look, Sky, as well, from your perspective, have you had to deal with any kind of resistance to adopting AI within your kind of framework as well, in your department?
So there are multiple parts to that question. First part is how does the company, at a company level, accept the level of risk associated with introducing something that's got a little bit of its own control. And so we have taken a very pragmatic approach. We talked about chasing the latest shiny toy down the road. That's not kind of the approach we take. We like to take it very simple and very slow. And so really kind of breaking it down into two parts. What are the non-value added activities versus the value added activities? And the non-value added activities, they're the target area for us to look at automation in any form, whether that's simple live chat, chatbot, all the way through to AI. And we take it very carefully because as soon as you go down that path, and let's say it's our external customer website with our external customers, you're handing over the customer experience to that piece of technology. So we haven't really gone all the way there. We've stopped at live chat as an example, mainly because we want to make sure that we've got customers adopting the website, adopting the digital experience before we go to the next level. I like to give customers choice, so I don't want to say you have to engage us this way. It is what is your preference, and we create different streams for that, whether that's even email, phone call, using live chat all the way to chatbot, and we allow them the choice. So that removes a lot of friction. Different age groups like different ways to interact. And so we really take a pragmatic approach, but we haven't gone all the way, let's say, to the full extreme, because from a brand perspective, that's very important to us. We want to make sure that we're protecting that and in more control. And so that's kind of how we adopt these things. But I just want to touch on an experience that Hani touched on with our ERP rollout. So we, a bit like those guys, no one wants to do the training documents. right? So no one wants to do the SOPs, none of that.
No surprises there.
So we brought in some technology that enabled them just to do the actual activity, and then the technology creates all the documentation for them, including the steps. It can be a video, it can be a PowerPoint, it can be a Word document. And as soon as they finish the actual activity, all the documents are created for them. And so that's how we've leveraged very simple examples of that's a great use case. Non-value add activity, not important. Low risk, not going to hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Great use case.
You get no pushback from anyone either, do you? Because you're creating the document for them.
We're creating time for them, which is what they want.
It also makes them shine.
Yeah.
I mean, the professional documents come out at the end, screen grabs, all the commentary, and all they had to do is just follow the steps in the sandbox. And
It makes their lives easier as well.
So that's a beautiful use case, low risk, not a value activity.
I know Nick was talking about a bit of a use case as well within kind of the ticketing system. Talk us through that, Nick.
Yeah, look, we've got multiple use cases at Brendan actually, but the one I was talking about earlier is the using predictive analytics when someone's locked themselves out of their mailbox, right? So we take tens of thousands of help desk calls. That's one of our core businesses. So we have a lot of inbound phone calls. And what we have discovered is that there's a percentage of those calls relating to I've lost my password, I'm locked out of the system. And by matching the mobile phone number of the user to the entitlement of the company, we can answer the phone and say, hey, we noticed that you've been locked out. Would you like us to reset your password? And invariably the answer is yes. And then we have to go through the authentication process correctly to make sure it's the right person, and then it gets reset. And then the automation goes on to say, do you have anything else you'd like to talk to us about? And 85% of the time the answer is no. And that call ends with no human interaction, but a very high level of NPS Net Promoter Score from the end users, because they didn't have to explain their problem. Their problem was asked to them. So the next iteration of that will be proactively phoning them when we see them locked out, and that's the next bit that we're working on.
And that automated interaction, do you log it in the system as a traditional call? Yeah,
exactly right.
So you can report on it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And yes, and you want to make sure you're capturing. We had 100 people from the same company with the same problem, so that we can root cause analysis and all that. So yeah, absolutely, all gets. Yeah.
And what's the end goal like? Would you like to learn? Is it usually a group of people, so you can then proactively approach them and say your password is about to expire?
Yeah, so it's interesting. What you see on massive amounts of data is that there are key times of year. January is one of them. Just after Easter is another one, where people have been away and they've sort of tuned out of work maybe, and they've forgotten their passwords. So personally, I think we're moving to a point where there'll be no passwords anymore.
Yep.
And so that day will come sooner than later. But in the interim, I think we're putting these steps in place to solve the problem we know is coming. And yes, we're already proactive about don't forget to reset your password. January is one of those times. Changing user behaviour more difficult than it should be.
Speaking of passwords, I'd love to know, where are you personally at with your password? Do you feel like you're mature enough to I guess, combat any sort of cyber hack or anything like that? Do you change your passwords often? Personally, I don't. I should. I need to change my password more often. Is that something that you do, Chris, that you keep in mind? Or
I have trouble, I'm in so many systems. I have trouble following our own discipline of not using the same password in each system. I mean, it's tough. I like it better when you're starting to use, your face.
Yeah,
there's a different school of thought, maybe. Not a password hygiene is not simply about changing it more often. So the hygiene comes from using long password phrases, not using the same one multiple times, using a password manager so you don't have to worry about it. You may not even know the password yourself, using multiple layers of multi-factor. So I think it's not necessary just to say, if I change it every month, I'm more secure, because it can be contrary. It can make you less secure. Yeah,
it's such a good point as well. I know if I'm changing it all the time, I tend to forget them or have to kind of store them somewhere else. And that then comes into our own data and how we store our own data. What's your own personal data maturity? I mean, Sid, do you feel like you're up to scratch?
I think I've got sort of, as Hani mentioned, multi-factor authentication always enabled. So the more layers you can put in between, just to make sure that sort of whatever activity is being logged, it is you. I mean, Apple ecosystem, you can see like if you're logging into a device, there's just different levels of passwords or the way to get into the machine. I mean, personally, I like to change every few years, but I do like to use password manager and multi-factor authentication. You still do find like you're doing a cleanup and you found an old device and you just turned it on just to see if it's still got data, and all of a sudden you've got activity logged in. If you didn't have layers in between, that same device could be out on the road. You might move out, might do something, and it can go in hands of somebody. So you just have to kind of be very cautious in that. But as sort of Nick mentioned earlier, like passwords are going, but I'm sure they'll bring new level of problems. Problems will always stay.
Well, that's right. As Chris will tell you, there's a whole raft of people out there trying to stay 1, 2 or 3 steps ahead of the new technology and the security solutions.
Well, more and more organisations are moving to this zero trust strategy of cybersecurity, and so that is using a lot of technology, AI and machine learning and other things to contextualise the identity of a person. So the fact that when you log in, the behaviour, where you're logging in from, what type of device. Conditional access can say, if my iPhone hasn't got the latest update, it won't allow me to jump onto the network. So I think that's where, with passwordless entry and sort of zero trust sort of methodologies there, you're going to find it, yes, whilst people are going to keep trying, this whole implicit trust not being provided is a significant change in the way we've managed cybersecurity in the past.
Yeah, I do think it's imperative though as well, and we were obviously talking about AI, but it is a bit of a double-edged sword because you've got the power of AI to mitigate climate security risks, cybersecurity risks rather, but then you've got the other side of it where it opens up a whole world and a whole raft of cybersecurity kind of options and risks as well. So I think it is that double-edged sword, but how do we balance that, do you think? Hani?
Yeah, I would say that, the bad actors at play are going to leverage every bit of technology they can. So it's incumbent on us to not bury our heads in the sand and say we need to lift our cyber hygiene and maturity and look at how we can leverage these things. Now, I think we're always at a disadvantage, right? Because they have one goal in mind. We have a goal to run a business, to deliver competitive advantage. And by the way, we've got to make it secure. So I learnt the hard way many years ago as a young CIO leading an organisation, really trying to add value. I found it very difficult to go to the board and ask for hundreds of thousands of dollars for improving our cybersecurity posture and not being able to say, I will guarantee we won't get breached if you give me this money, because you can't. No. And so, but it was much easier to ask for money and demonstrate a return on investment and an outcome. But I think with maturity, you sort of develop confidence and say, no, I'm not going to back down. We need to invest in cyber, And so, like I said, I personally learned the hard way. And so you just got to continually keep it at the forefront,
Yeah.
So just on that, I don't think you can ever win.
Yeah.
No. There's no kind of full stop. We've done everything we need to do.
Yeah, it's an infinite game.
You've got to continually evolve and invest and get your posture right, constantly test. And so you've got to invest that money in the appropriate audits, the appropriate partners, the appropriate SOC. You've got to get everything kind of settled. But then you've got to keep going. It just doesn't stop.
And the biggest problem we all face is that the bad actors have one goal to break in, and they have the weakest link to find. And that weakest link often is one of our employees or someone already in our environment that we've given some sort of trust to. So there's not only is there making your environment as secure as you can, zero trust is absolutely a great step for that, I think. There is the how do I stop my employees from doing something stupid?
Yeah, insider threats, I think we don't often talk about that. We often focus on the outsider threats, but insider threats is also a consideration we really need to think about as well. And I know Chris works with a lot, major big universities. And how do you kind of mitigate insider threats, Chris?
Well, the reason it's difficult, I think, is because people within an organization think in a linear fashion. You've always got the latest version of this or the latest. The people trying to get into our organizations think exponentially, and so they're miles ahead of us. It's It's a game of catch-up that you are playing all the time. And I'm now advocating mandatory training for everyone in the organization, everyone, CEO on down. And we have to move from spending 1% to 3% of our budgets on training to 5%, 10%, because that's the only thing that will save us. You want resilience, get resilient employees. No resilient employees, all the CIOs in the world glommed into one won't be able to save you.
And not all organisations have a CISO as well. So often it is just on you, it is on the CIO to really make sure they're covering all bases when it comes to cybersecurity. But if you do have a CISO, how do you like to kind of work closely with that CISO? Sid, do you guys have a CISO?
We don't have a CISO.
So you've got that responsibility on yourself. Yeah, it's not easy to be on top of it all the time.
Yes, yeah, you have to kind of choose a very careful decision whether what is it that you're focusing on, internal security, intrusion protection, or extra filtration. So we kind of have taken a few different approaches. There's no right answer. You just have to make a decision and just work towards making it right. I think most of the time the issues come from not being able to make the decision. There will never be 100% bulletproof solution, I think. So you kind of have to constantly balance what area are you focusing on. So you kind of are looking at the OSI model and constantly looking through all the layers, whether it's application, security, data layer, network layer. That's kind of now a subroutine or part of your subconscious. You're constantly thinking like that now.
Yeah, you never stop thinking. I think your brain's always ticking as well. And Hani, you mentioned also asking for money and communicating with our boards. It is hard to, I guess, when you can't demonstrate direct ROI, it's actually hard to ask for money when it comes to
I thought it was. I don't think it is. I think I've learned to chew it over the time, but I think, starting, if you haven't got a CISO on board, I think educate yourself, because you still bear that responsibility. And I had to do that. And, it all started by identifying what are my assets, where are they, getting a register in place, and then, doing a risk treatment plan and saying, well, what value do these assets hold for me? And then working out, make sure I've got mitigations in place. Now, that's just a starting point. This is a very, I suppose when I talk about, it's a governance-driven approach. But more these days, it's all about a defensive approach and having, cyber threat intelligence, using the SOC as a service if you can't afford one, just to understand what's the threat landscape, what's it look like, what should you be looking at? Because as Sid says, well, where do you start? And if you take an internal risk managed approach, you're still going to be blindsided. But if you understand what's the threat landscape and what people are going after, you can make sure that that you're protected in those areas. And I think you'll get much more return on investment if you look at it that way, not just a plain risk governance perspective.
Yeah, so just touching on return on investment, reputational damage.
Yes.
Can't get that back.
Can't get that back.
Can't get that back, right? So usually heads go when that happens. So the board, I think, is becoming more educated as organisations have been hacked, and the exposure that everybody has, particularly around the sensitive data, the private, personal data that we're holding. As organisations, I think, reputational damage, once that's gone, very hard to get back.
Yeah. And how do you kind of get that tech literacy and cybersecurity literacy up when it comes to communicating with the board? Can you train them in some way and get them up to scratch?
Yeah, there's a bunch of simulations you can do these days that help them simulate scenarios and how they'd respond. We've done that recently at Canon. We have a security officer and we have a privacy officer. And they'll run the exec team and senior leaders through scenarios. So here's what's happened. How do you respond? What's the next action? And we'll test ourselves through that, and then we'll get you should have done that better, or you should have done this better, or, so you've got to invest that time in simulating, and the board can also do that as well. But I think they're very aware.
Yep, I agree. Boards are more aware than ever about the cyber security problem and the liability that flows from the reputation and loss.
What I do every year is download the Australian cybersecurity report. and I summarise it and I put a bit of a 15-minute slide deck together and I present it to them and say, this is what's happened in the last 12 months. This is where things are shifting. This is where people are targeting. And then I generally look at our posture and say, well, what are we doing to mitigate some of these things? What are we in place? And if there's any gaps, I'll tell them. I say, I think there's a bit of a gap here. We need to invest more or change something. But I use that as an annual way of engagement.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, fantastic.
Constant communication, I think, is important. Keeping people sort of always on the lookout. So we do a lot of phishing campaigns, basically try and do some social engineering stuff, like we'll call up sort of internal users, want to get them access into a store or server room. So we now sort of are looking at annual sort of a pen testing approach across all areas, not just hardware, software, but also people. Because usually if you've taken care of hardware and software, the only weakest link then is people. So then try and engage with them on a social level to see whether they'll be able to let you into the building. So basically having that surprise element.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on that. So I've learnt a lot about cybersecurity through our internal mandatory training. And then we get tested through phishing.
Yes.
And so we have to do that every year. We never know when it's coming. We know when the training is because it's in our system and tells us, I've got 5 days to complete this year's training. But the phishing is very interesting to see who just becomes complacent for that little moment and we're in. So that's very interesting. So they'll go X amount of this level, opened it, X amount of that level, did the right thing and raised the ticket and deleted it. And so it's very thorough, but certainly...
and the breakthrough rate's never zero though, is it?
It's never zero.
Always someone.
No, it actually affects your insurances. So I use less than 15% of people who get phished in a simulation impacts your insurance renewal. So it's something that's very important. And so the training and the simulations, we do it twice a year minimum.
Yeah, and you just can't afford to get compliant these days, can you, really? And Chris, I know the education industry looks a little bit different as well, and you've worked globally. So how do you compare, I guess, from what you're hearing today to the global landscape within education as well?
Well, first of all, I think the CISO was invented by the CIO not to have that as a problem. Because I'm wishing I had one, at least. I think worldwide, it's out there, but I don't think people get it yet. And I don't think people are aware. You guys, I think, are much more aware than most of us in the public sector. Partly because I think you're more at risk financially than we are. We just get bad reputation. But if information gets out, it's awful. Heads do roll, but they don't shut down the hospital system. And I think that's part of the problem. You guys have really hard bottom lines that will suffer. And so I think you're doing more education than many people are. And worldwide, I can't tell you worldwide because I've moved so rapidly. And, a generation, it was 3 years, it was then 2 years, and it's 1 year. ChatGPT, I think you're under a year. So I don't even know what part of my experience is still relevant to talk about because so much has happened.
Yeah.
And it's happening today. As we're sitting here, someone's breaking into your company. You know what I mean?
Right.
Hani's like, definitely not happening.
Hundreds of thousands of times a day, I can tell you, I've got the stats.
It is.
Yeah.
Wow. And Chris, speaking of your experience, obviously you've 20 years plus, if you could just sum up in a couple of words, how has technology changed within that 20 years? It's pretty incredible, isn't it?
It is things that I'm a science fiction buff for years. It's things we never imagined would happen, did happen, have happened, and are there today. Without drama, without fanfare. It's just here. Artificial intelligence is here. I never thought that would really happen, but it has happened, and it's dramatic, and it's enormously enabling and disabling at the same time. I've never felt so a threat. I used to spend maybe 1% of my time early in my career worrying about security. Now it's like 40 or 50% of my time. So the more powerful the tools, the greater the risk.
Yeah, and does everyone else kind of feel the same within their careers as well as the threat landscape changes? Do you feel similar to Chris that you're more focused on that piece, that 40% of your time is spent thinking about that? Would you say, Hani?
I would say, look, because I've had some personal experience with it, it definitely, it's a pivotal moment in my career. It's just, and I took it upon myself to get educated and understand the environment. And, you talk about the CISO being invented by the CIO because it's a huge remit. And it's you got to live and breathe and sleep, security. It's not something that you can turn off. And it always goes back to the people, as you say, it's, how social media, how people share so freely, how that information with AI gets scraped and gets turned into, a phishing simulation or a phishing attack. And so all these things, trying to make people constantly aware and understanding the threat landscape is a full-time job, and you can't do it on your own.
No.
So you need support. But to have that awareness, it starts from there and continually communicate and understand people what's at jeopardy. I think is a good starting
think people
point.
share without knowing that they're sharing sometimes. Phishing. I was trying to help. I wasn't sharing. Well, you did, but I wasn't. I was trying to do something good. And I think that's the battle, is how you get people to get the idea that in this environment, we're under attack.
But with the flip side, though, that the IT landscape changes so quickly and enables you so much that if you don't do something, you risk, a competitive disadvantage, right?
Yes,
so
true.
you have to live in this, you're straddling a world of, I need to keep it secure, but I need to move forward.
Absolutely. And you need to keep innovating. You have to balance innovation between security. And as long as you're thinking about that, right, and doing something about it, it's not, if you go full steam ahead with innovation and trying to develop competitive advantage or maintain without thinking about that security by design as fundamental, you will get unstuck at some point.
Like I love all of my team members at work. My 3 favourite are my robots.
They don't make mistakes.
Highly engaged. Don't need to sleep, don't need lunch breaks, and highly high performing.
Also very consistent, I'm sure,
very
as well.
Very consistent. And the only time they make mistakes is when someone else has given them the wrong information. And I tell you that jokingly, but I always talk about my 3 robots. They're named after Transformers, so they're a bit geeky, but they do some amazing work. But what they've done is they've enabled the value-added activities to go to the brains. And that's where I want people to be. Using your intelligence to interpret. And then as we get more insight into that, we'll then move the people further along and we'll bring in some activity, some data activity behind that. And so that's progressively how I've moved the operation forward. I'm very lucky in that I am the business and I am the transformation guy, so I get to do both. So whatever we're transforming is actually helping the operation. So I'm very lucky in that I can see firsthand what we're doing to enable. Self-service is another very simple way we do it. Within the customer portal, we have the chatbot, we have the live chat, and we have the ability to connect through to the robot first and then the human second. So a very, very structured way in which we're enabling people to interact with us in a much more safer and secure way. And the firewalls do their jobs, which is what we want them to do. So
I think security in general sort of has to completely change because we naturally think security as defensive always. So most of the time people are looking at what defensive strategies do we have, and we always forget to play the offensive game. So what can you do as a preventative approach? How often are you talking about security incidents? Just like we would look at security as service, out there criminals are looking at cybercrime as service. And there are places where people actually sell those as packages, which is just sort of, so as sort of Chris mentioned earlier, people are miles and miles ahead of us. So you have to constantly be thinking like that, and I think nothing better than basically preventative approach.
And they're not they don't have the obligation to keep a business running. They just have the obligation to get in and take what they can take.
Yes. Most of the time it's value creation, right? So if you can sort of seal off your points of exit of data, whether it's through personalized training for people when you're onboarding them, making sure that they're thinking about why password complexity is there and why do we do these campaigns, and whenever they are signing up to services. I mean, simple things like most of the time we spend our sort of good 8 hours of our day in organizations. Most of the time people use their organizational email addresses for online shopping, right? So then people leave, emails get forwarded, and all of a sudden you've got this random link from some great fashion site. Somebody clicks on it. Like enabling those sort of processes to be shut down early on. So educating people to basically keep the personal and professional separate helps organizations kind of be a bit more secure.
So I guess it's really important to have that robust governance around your tech stack as well, and also just your tech department in general. But I want to go back to Sky's comment about his robots, because I know it's hard for staff, especially within a large organisation. They get concerned that robots are going to take their job. So what do you tell them when you've got your 3 favourite robots? What do you tell them when they're worried about that?
Very similar to what I mentioned a bit earlier. So you really just help them understand, the activities that you're doing here, do you really enjoy them? And inevitably they'll say no. So we want to move you up the value chain so you can learn, number 1. Number 2, you can add more value. Number 3, build your own career. So let's get you out of these activities and move you to these activities, and let's let the robot do what it's designed to do. And so that's kind of the pitch we take people through. Thankfully, we've never had to terminate any employees as a result of the robot. And so we've been able to back that up through the way in which we've operated. Natural attrition we'll consider, but really just moving people up the value chain. And there are some things that you want to get to, you just can't get to because people are doing the mundane. As you move them out of the mundane, you can get to those things. And so there's a personal benefit to them, and there's also a benefit to the organisation, and we let the mundane get done behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And so it's been a very natural and easy conversation personally to have.
It's a great story to tell because, I mean, everyone has their own experiences, I think, but I'd love to hear, Nick, what you're hearing from your clients as well when it comes to this conversation around AI and how to get staff on board with the whole idea.
Exactly the same conversation that Sky's talking about. It's a redeployment conversation. It's how do you build your own career and stop doing the mundane. And it's literally a conversation and a narrative we've heard over and over again. And I agree. I think it's the right one, and it builds that confidence. And as you say, when you live those values, then you build confidence in your workforce that it isn't just words, it's actually how you're treating them.
Yeah, definitely. And we've spoken about the data maturity piece briefly as well, but again, we can't emphasise how important that is. What kind of advice do you usually have, Nick, when it comes to speaking to anyone you're working with?
Oh, look, I think about AI at the top of a triangle. At the bottom of that triangle is infrastructure. To your point around, Hani, around the maturity, right? If you have to have a very mature infrastructure base, be that cloud or on-prem, whatever your infrastructure layer is, has to be rock solid and well understood. The middle layer is data. How do you gather it? How do you secure it? How do you govern it? Really, really important layer. And when we look at most customers, that's the area where help is most needed. The infrastructure is pretty well understood, been around for a long time, largely quite mature. This data in the middle, less so, often, not always. And then at the top of that triangle is the AI, where it draws from if you're doing AI in a really beneficial way, I think you're using your own internal data. And that means you need to have a really good structure and governance and security around your data. And so that's where we look first, normally, is in that area.
I think fundamental what you missed there is the people element, though. I would say digital literacy of the organisation.
Yep.
If they're not ready to adopt and embrace the work that you've done at the technology stack or anything in between, I think you're always going to suffer. So I think that work needs to be done. And I think you can't speed that up. Like, it's not something you can just jump. You've got to gradually look at how they work. For example, if an organisation hasn't got any RPA running through it and they're still doing everything longhand, and suddenly you want to jump that step, I think it's going to be very difficult because you've got to get through that. So when you get those people adopted or embracing RPA, they want the next thing. They get it. They go, right, okay. So when you introduce the next level of sort of automation or hyper automation, they're on board because they get it. And so that has to filter through the organisation fundamentally.
Yeah, it really is in that training piece as well. It really is in that training sentiment that I think you've all echoed today, is making sure that everyone gets enough training. And Chris, you've been on that journey as well with your current role. Talk us through that.
Well, I have spent with SAP my life in Oracle, 28% of the original purchase price a year, buying it every 5 years all over again. SAP, as expensive as it is, isn't as expensive as the people. And yet our service contract on people is training, and we're spending 1% to 3%. Are we crazy? I mean, literally, it's people, and they are the biggest. They're the biggest victims, and they're the biggest inadvertent, malicious people in our systems because they just don't think about something because we haven't sensitized them. Or they think this doesn't matter this time.
Yeah.
And they just do it, and then it's too late.
And data plays a really important role there too, because it's people who are gathering the data. For what purpose? For analysis, right? So it's mostly people interacting with the data. So you kind of have to look at both together. And most of the organizations have high unstructured data combined with people who are looking for information for analysis. So then how do you actually get AI to go through all this unstructured data to provide precise answers? It's like you have to go through that natural organic growth into RPA processes, and then you'll end up with highly structured data, but then you have to constantly train them. And you have to constantly reinforce. People will make mistakes because there's different things at play. They are trying to get to somewhere, they want to do something fast. There's a bunch of different priorities. So mistakes are bound to happen. You just have to constantly remind them, this is the right process.
And as a former educator, the shock for me was realizing that many people, when you say, we're changing the way you do it, think, you're saying I was bad.
Yes.
You're saying I was wrong. I wasn't bad and I wasn't wrong. I was doing what you said before, and now you've changed it.
Yes.
And there's an emotional component that's really difficult to get around.
They feel undervalued because somebody else has come in and basically demonstrated a process in a much more effective way. Yeah. Probably the best course there is, I think, as sort of Nick mentioned earlier, take them through that journey. They have to buy in. They have to buy into it. And then, like as you mentioned, creating that value sort of proposition for them. It's a progression. You're now leaving all the mundane activities for something else. You can focus more on using your knowledge in a more intelligent way.
Yeah, so utilising agile development methodologies and bringing those business stakeholders involved with the development team and crafting a solution where they become, at the end of the day, the ambassador for the output.
Yeah.
And they drive adoption because they've got skin in the game. They contributed to the solution is hugely important.
They become that champion of that change.
And it just spawns, and that's how you build digital literacy through the company.
Yeah, we're even hearing from our own research that it's those soft skills as a leader that is so imperative at this point as well, having that empathy for your own staff too. And I mean, just to kind of wrap up the session, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a key learning and what tech leaders need in 2024. I mean, Sky, did you want to kick us off?
Sure. Humans are complex creatures, and so I think on the change perspective, you've really got to, you talked about empathy, take them on the journey of change and help them understand the why behind the change. So, that for me, coming from a change background predominantly, I always thought you push through and bring them on the way, and that doesn't work. It creates a big gap. So really, it's actually standing behind them and kind of helping them understand and getting them there. So I think that's kind of learning number one for me. Number two, it's ever evolving. It just doesn't stop. And so having the right IP in the business, having the ability to say, I'm not actually aware of that, and being humble enough to realise you don't know everything, I think is really important. So having the intelligence in the room to get to the right conclusion, and being okay not being the smartest person in the room, like I am today, which is wonderful to be with you guys.
I was going to give Sky some advice. I'd probably say don't start with the 3-bot story.
Don't go with I love my 3 bots.
Don't lead with that story first.
Cut that out.
Oh, that's my favourite part.
So there's a couple of learnings from me. There's many more, but let's go through.
I suppose as a change leader, you talk about change leader. That's why I'd say don't start with the bot story. But my key learning and reflection on what makes it effective in terms of change enablement led through technology is understand the business. This whole thing, business and IT, shouldn't exist. It's the business. IT is the business. And so, ensuring that you're engaged with the business, understand the business, how they make money, what's the risks that they're trying to navigate, and be part of that problem solving. be a technology advisor for the business. I think that is very powerful to start with. That way you'll find you'll get invited to the discussions. When they go to put a tender in for something, IT's got a seat on the table, they know you can contribute. And don't think that you don't have any value because it's not a topic of your expertise. You can always contribute once you understand the business.
Can I just add to that? I just want to add one other thing. Don't get emotionally attached to the recommendation.
Yeah.
Because if it gets turned down, you've got to be able to go, what's right for the business, not
Absolutely.
not
You've
my
got to
own.
be able to let that go pretty quickly.
You've got to park the emotions, just go, here's the facts, here's options, which way do we go?
Yep. I think what Chris started off, the very first question he put forward to us was that, what he found struck him was it wasn't about the technology. It was always about the people was the challenge. And so he thought, okay, I get in, I research, I get technology, I just put it in and no problem. And it was always the people was the challenge. And so again, understanding the business and getting the people engaged, whether you're making micro changes or you're making wholesale changes, understand the business and the problem you're trying to solve, and then use change management to communicate and bring them along that journey.
How about you, Sid?
I think I've had a couple of key learnings, and I would agree with both sort of Hani and yourself here that like the biggest things that are basically allowing us to make changes is rebranding IT. It's not a separate area. It's part of the organization. It's part of the business, living and breathing with the business. So we've thought about sort of changing our team basically to be rebranded to business systems rather than just IT. I think again there is no set solution always. Everyone's different, so just being there with the people on the journey, you have to handhold them through the experience. That's how you will create digital literacy in the organization. There is no one-stop solution for every person. So I think we are here to solve problems, and that's the kind of approach that we take in our department. We are always here to solve whatever problem you might have, be it IT or not. We are here to solve business problems.
Certainly. Now, Chris, any final words from you?
Yeah, I think for me, the learning that I'm constantly learning again and again and again is there's no one customer. They're all customers and they're all different. And I sort of have to remember what hat to put on when I'm talking to them. And it's difficult because sometimes I find myself backed into the corner where I have to own something. And a CIO should never own something. If you want to kill it, own it. Do you know what I mean? So you should, and you don't get emotionally attached. I think there are times in my career where I have gotten emotionally attached, saying this is the right thing to do, we will do this, and I should just break down and shoot it at that point because it will never succeed. So it's your customers, every person around this table is a customer with different needs, and I find I have to be a bit of a chameleon in some ways to change the way I am for each person.
Got to be very adaptable. I mean, Nick, you've got our last final word before we wrap up.
Yeah, look, I think very much in line with what Chris was saying. I think you started that question about leadership and IT leadership, and I think the dawning on me of leadership was a long time ago. I heard the saying, "My team doesn't work for me; I work for them." And I think it's really important that we remember that, to your point about being a chameleon and being able to give the people in your team and the people in your organisation the thing they need at the time they need it. That's the really important art of leadership. It's not easy to do, and it requires lots of empathy and a little bit of chameleon. But it is an important element to empower all of the people in the organisation.
Now, thank you to all of you for joining us today. It's been a really insightful discussion, and we hope to see you back at our next sit down. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.